The air in Dr. Aris Thorne's bioengineering lab hung heavy with the metallic tang of burnt circuitry and something else, something acrid and deeply unsettling. Twisted steel girders groaned faintly, still settling from the catastrophic event that had ripped through the space. Glass walls, once transparent partitions to high-tech workstations, were now jagged teeth, reflecting the pulsating emergency lights like scattered rubies. This wasn't just a lab, it was a tomb, meticulously designed for groundbreaking research, now reduced to a testament of violent entropy. I stepped over a collapsed ventilation duct, my boots crunching on a mosaic of shattered monitors and pulverized concrete. The initial assessment was already being whispered among the uniformed officers: a tragic lab accident, perhaps a volatile reaction, or even a desperate act of self-destruction by a reclusive genius. Dr. Thorne, a name synonymous with innovation in genetic sequencing, lay dead amidst the wreckage, his body grotesquely contorted, partially obscured by a fallen beam. The medical examiner, a stoic woman with tired eyes, was already making her preliminary observations, her voice a low murmur against the crackle of distant radios. "Looks like a flash fire, Reed," he stated, not looking up from examination. "Massive thermal trauma, consistent with an uncontrolled energy release. Likely instantaneous." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the devastation. The official narrative was straightforward, almost too neat. Thorne was known for pushing boundaries, for working with highly sensitive biological agents, for an intensity that bordered on obsession. A lab accident, especially one involving a bioengineer of his caliber, wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. Suicide, given the high-pressure world he inhabited, also couldn't be immediately dismissed. But my gut, a well-honed instrument after years of sifting through the aftermath of the stale air in the police department basement holding forensic samples, hung heavy, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic, something that always clung to the aftermath of violence. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unwavering glow on the stainless steel examination table where Aris Thorne lay. His body, or what remained of it, was a testament to the brutal force unleashed in his lab. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the snap echoing in the quiet space. The pathologist, a woman with tired eyes and precise movements, nodded a greeting without looking up from him. Initial assessment. "Good to see you, Reed. This one's a mess." "Understatement of the year," I murmured, leaning closer. The official line was a catastrophic lab accident, a tragic miscalculation. But my gut, that persistent, nagging part of me, had been screaming otherwise since I'd first stepped into the scorched remains of Thorne's research facility. The pathologist began her methodical narration, her voice flat, professional. "Extensive thermal damage, as expected. Primary burns are consistent with a flash explosion from the front, torso, and head most affected. Secondary blast injuries, internal hemorrhaging, fractured ribs, skull trauma. All consistent with being thrown against a hard surface." She gestured to a series of lacerations on his back. "And impact wounds from debris." I focused on the details she skimmed over. The burn patterns, for instance. While severe, they seemed contained. Not the widespread, chaotic devastation I'd expect from a truly runaway reaction. I traced the edges of a particularly deep char mark on Thorne's left forearm. "What about the depth here?" She peered through her magnifying loupe. "Deep tissue, almost to the bone in some areas. But it's a focused burn, not a broad splash. Almost as if a directed thermal pulse. My internal gears clicked. A directed thermal pulse. Not a general conflagration. This supported my initial suspicion that the source of the energy might have been contained, perhaps even aimed. And the internal injuries? Any inconsistencies with the external trauma? That's where it gets interesting, the pathologist said, her brow furrowing. The skull trauma, specifically. It's a single, blunt force impact to the occipital region. Consistent with being thrown and hitting a wall, yes. But the force required, given the angle of the blast. It feels almost too neat. And there's no corresponding impact site on the front of the head, which you might expect from a rebound. She paused, then pointed to a minute discoloration on Thorne's temple. And this. A faint, almost invisible abrasion. Not from debris, not from the blast. I bent closer, bringing my own loupe to bear. It was barely there, a whisper of a mark, almost lost amidst the other, more spectacular injuries. It looked like a friction burn, impossibly small, impossibly precise. My gaze drifted to Thorne's hands, surprisingly intact save for some blistering. He'd been wearing heavy-duty lab gloves, but they had been vaporized in the blast. I ran a gloved finger over the skin of his right palm. It felt rougher than it should have, despite the burns. Hold on, I said, a sudden prickle of intuition. I signaled to the pathologist for a micro-vacuum kit. Carefully, meticulously, I worked over Thorne's palm, then between his fingers, collecting what little particulate matter remained. Under the microscope, the first flecks I saw were typical lab dust, ceramic, glass, various polymers. Then, a cluster of something else. Tiny, iridescent flakes, almost like miniature fish scales, but with a metallic glint. They were irregular, angular, and had a distinctive coppery sheen. What is that? The pathologist asked, leaning in. I have no idea, I admitted, my voice tight with a rising excitement. But it's not from Thorne's lab. Not from any industrial abrasive or material I've ever seen associated with bioengineering. This is something else entirely. The discovery solidified my conviction. Thorne hadn't just died in an accident. He had been murdered, and the killer had left a unique, microscopic calling card. My next stop was an interview room, stark and impersonal. The first individual brought in was the rival scientist, a man named Silas Vance. He sat opposite me, his posture stiff, a veneer of professional grief barely concealing a simmering resentment. Dr. Vance, I began, my voice even, can you describe your relationship with Aris Thorne? He cleared his throat. Competitive, certainly. We operated in similar fields, though his methodologies were unorthodox. Risky, some would say. Risky enough to cause an explosion? Vance scoffed, a quick, dismissive sound. Thorne was brilliant, yes, but he cut corners. He pushed boundaries without regard for safety protocols. His research, particularly his final project, was highly volatile. He believed he was on the verge of something truly world-changing. He was very secretive about it. And you wanted access to that research? I watched his eyes, the flicker of defensiveness. Naturally. Any scientist would. But I respected the ethical lines. Thorne, less so. He paused, then added, he was a difficult man. Made many enemies. He stole ideas, credit. He wasn't above sabotaging others to get ahead. His words painted a picture of intense academic rivalry, a clear motive for someone to want Thorne out of the way, or at least his research in their hands. Later, the former research assistant, Maya, sat in the same chair, her shoulders slumped. Her expression was a mix of weariness and lingering anger. Thorne was a tyrant, she stated, her voice low and strained. He took everything. My ideas, my time, my passion. He promised me co-authorship, a share in the patents. When the breakthrough came, he cut me out completely. When was this? I asked, leaning forward slightly. About 6 months ago. He said my contributions were insufficient. He said I wasn't visionary enough. I left. I couldn't stand to be near him, watching him take credit for my sleepless nights. Did you ever try to access his lab after you left? She shook her head emphatically. No. The security was insane. He changed all the codes after I left, locked me out of the digital files. He was paranoid, convinced someone would steal his magnum opus. Do you know anything about this magnum opus? Only that he believed it would revolutionize everything. Energy, medicine, I don't know. He spoke in riddles, especially towards the end. But it was definitely something big. Something dangerous. As I reviewed my notes, the pieces refused to fit into a simple accident. The specific burn patterns, the inexplicable head trauma, the unique metallic dust, and now, the human element, the bitter rivalry, the raw resentment. Thorne hadn't just died, he'd been targeted. The killer wasn't just trying to hide a murder, they were trying to frame it as a self-inflicted disaster, intimately familiar with Thorne's work and his reputation for recklessness. And that made this a far more dangerous game than I'd initially imagined. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glow on the rows of secure lockers and the isolated workstations. I sat hunched over a console, my fingers flying across the keyboard, the screen a dizzying cascade of code and file directories. The digital ghost of Thorne's research was my next target. My initial sweep of the lab's network had yielded an encrypted data drive, physically removed from Thorne's primary workstation. A professional move, designed to look like a standard shutdown, but the drive's contents were far from standard. It took me 3 hours, 2 specialized decryption tools, and a deep dive into Thorne's known digital habits to crack the first layer. What unfolded on the screen was a labyrinth of project files, most of them related to advanced genetic sequencing. Project Chimera, Project Genesis, Project Aegis, the names alone hinted at the scale of Thorne's ambition, and the dangerous tightrope he walked between global health breakthroughs and potential bioweaponry. I traced the file access logs, noting timestamps, user IDs, and data transfers. Thorne's routine was meticulous, almost obsessive, until about 3 weeks before his death. That's when the anomalies began. Small, almost imperceptible changes at first, a file accessed and closed without modification, a series of failed login attempts from an unknown IP address that was quickly scrubbed from the system logs. Then, more blatant. A large block of data, labeled Phase 4 genetic stabilizers, had been copied to an external server, a server I couldn't immediately identify. And then, the attempted wipe. It wasn't a crude deletion. This was sophisticated, multi-layered data destruction, designed to overwrite the original files multiple times, making recovery virtually impossible. But the perpetrator hadn't accounted for the network's redundant backup protocols, a failsafe Thorne himself had implemented. I found the ghostly remnants of the erased files, fragments of code and metadata, enough to confirm their existence and the deliberate intent to expunge them. Someone had tried to erase Thorne's most recent work, specifically the Phase 4 project, from existence. Not just from his lab, but from the network itself. The precision suggested intimate knowledge of Thorne's digital architecture, or access to someone who did. My mind raced. Was Thorne trying to hide something himself, perhaps a dangerous discovery he wanted to keep secret? Or had an external party, aware of his work, gained access and tried to bury the evidence? The latter felt more likely, given the murder. This wasn't just about killing Thorne, it was about silencing his research, or more accurately, controlling it. The screen flickered, displaying a partially recovered document. It was a research proposal, dated just a month prior, detailing the ethical implications of a genomic resequencing agent with unprecedented speed and specificity. The applications listed were chillingly vague: rapid disease eradication and targeted biological countermeasures. The potential for misuse was colossal, a weapon disguised as a cure. The tension in my shoulders tightened, a cold knot forming in my gut. This wasn't just corporate espionage, it was something far more dangerous. I needed to speak with Thorne's assistant again, the quiet woman named Maya. Her initial interview had been brief, guarded. Now, armed with this new information, I knew what questions to ask. I found the assistant in a small, windowless office, sorting through archived lab reports. She looked up, her eyes wide, then quickly dropped her gaze back to the papers. Her movements were hesitant, her posture hunched, as if trying to shrink into herself. The usual professional composure she'd maintained during our previous interaction had evaporated, replaced by a palpable unease. "I need to ask you a few more questions about Dr. Thorne's research," I began, keeping my voice level. "Specifically, about the Phase 4 genetic stabilizers project." Her hands stilled. He didn't look up. I don't know much about that, Reed. Dr. Thorne kept most of his core research very close. Something with significant implications, potentially for global health or even defense. I watched her closely, searching for any flicker of recognition, any tell. She nodded slowly, her head still bowed. He believed it could change everything. For better, or worse. She paused, a shiver running through her frame. He was becoming very guarded. Paranoid, almost. He started encrypting everything, even files I usually had access to. He kept saying they were watching, they were trying to get his work. Who were they? I pressed, stepping closer to her desk. She finally met my gaze, and her eyes held a profound fear I hadn't seen before. He never said. Just them. He was convinced someone was trying to steal his research, or control it. He even changed his routine, started taking different routes to the lab, checking for tails. He was always looking over his shoulder. Her voice cracked on the last word. He said he was close to a breakthrough, something that would make him either a hero or a target. Did he ever mention any specific threats? He said if his work fell into the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic. She looked away again, her gaze fixed on a distant, unseen point. He seemed so certain he was being watched. I just thought. It was the pressure. The intensity of his work. I studied her, absorbing her words, her fear. Thorne's paranoia wasn't just a symptom of stress, it was a premonition. He knew he was in danger, and someone had indeed been watching, waiting, and ultimately, acting. The killer wasn't just a murderer, they were a thief, and the prize was far more valuable than I had initially imagined. A quiet corner of the university campus, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Dr. Thorne was difficult, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He pushed us, pushed himself. He was obsessed with his project, wouldn't let anyone else near it. Not even me, towards the end. What was the project, Maya? I asked gently. She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. It was groundbreaking. Something about advanced genetic markers, a way to resequence human cells for purposes I didn't fully understand. But he was so secretive. He fired me 2 months ago, said I was a distraction. I think he just wanted to work alone. Any hard feelings after being fired? She shook her head slowly. More fear than anger. He was changing, becoming paranoid. He thought people were watching him, trying to steal his work. I was upset, yes, but I respected his genius. I wouldn't hurt him. I wasn't even in the city when it happened, visiting family. Her alibi, like Vance's, seemed solid. But her fear, that was genuine. It resonated with Thorne's alleged paranoia, painting a picture of a man under siege, not just a victim of bad luck. Armed with the knowledge of Thorne's paranoia, I delved into the digital remnants of his lab, a task that required navigating layers of encryption and bespoke security protocols. The IT specialist, a quiet individual with quick fingers, worked diligently beside me in the police department basement, where we'd set up a temporary digital forensics station. He really didn't want anyone getting into this, Reed, the specialist murmured, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. Multiple firewalls, custom-built authentication. It's like he was preparing for an invasion. After hours of painstaking, the fluorescent lights of the police department basement holding forensic samples hummed a steady, dull drone above me. The air was cool, smelling faintly of ozone and disinfected concrete. I hunched over my microscope, the tiny, iridescent polymer fragments from Thorne's lab accident glowing under the focused beam. My fingers, accustomed to precision, manipulated the microtweezers, separating a particularly stubborn filament from a charred piece of circuit board. The attempted data wipe from the previous day still grated at me. It wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a clear signal that someone wanted specific evidence gone, and the polymer, I suspected, was high on that list. My eyes scanned the screen of the mass spectrometer, watching the peaks and valleys of its analysis. This wasn't just a random synthetic compound. The unique spectral signature suggested a highly specialized, perhaps even proprietary, formulation. It was unlike anything commercially available, a bespoke creation. I cross-referenced the data with known industrial polymers, academic research papers, and even obscure patents. Nothing quite matched. This material wasn't just at the scene, it was part of the scene, woven into the fabric of the destruction, but subtly distinct from the structural components of Thorne's equipment. It felt like a signature, a deliberately placed element, or perhaps a residue from a tool used in the act. My phone vibrated on the workbench. It was Maya. I hadn't expected him to call so soon. "Reed," he began, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you. Alone. It's about Thorne." Her urgency was palpable, a tremor beneath her carefully controlled tone. "I'm working on something here," I said, my gaze still fixed on the spectrometer readings. A new peak was emerging, sharper, more defined than the others. "Can you meet me later? My personal lab, say, 9 tonight?" "Yes." "Please be careful, Reed." The line went dead. Her warning, coupled with the strange polymer, sharpened my focus. The material had a high thermal resistance, far beyond what would be expected from a simple lab accident. It could withstand extreme temperatures without significant degradation, almost as if designed for it. And the way it was distributed. Not uniform, but concentrated in specific areas, almost implanted. I saved my data, secured the samples in their labeled containers, and locked down my section of the basement. The drive home was usually a quiet, almost meditative transition from the intensity of the lab. Not tonight. My mind was still buzzing with the polymer's unusual properties. I took the longer route, a habit born of an innate cautiousness, but also because the backstreets offered fewer red lights and a quicker pace. As I approached an intersection, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, a black sedan, windows tinted opaque, shot out from a side street. No signal, no hesitation. It wasn't just fast, it was accelerating directly into my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing in protest, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin. My car lurched, the seatbelt biting into my shoulder, stopping mere inches from the sedan's side panel. The driver didn't even glance my way. The vehicle sped off, its taillights rapidly shrinking into the night. My hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white. An accident or something else? The cold knot in my stomach tightened. I knew the difference between reckless driving and a deliberate maneuver. This felt like the latter. A message, perhaps, or a test. The incident solidified my resolve. And someone was trying to ensure I remained silent too. Arriving at my personal lab, a renovated industrial space on the edge of the city, I parked in my usual, discreet spot. I disarmed the alarm, the familiar beep echoing in the empty hallway. Everything seemed normal. But as I stepped into my main workspace, a subtle shift in the air caught my attention. The faint, metallic tang of my solvent dispenser was slightly off, not quite as sharp as it should be. I moved slowly, scanning the room. My tools were in place, the workbench tidied as I'd left it that morning. But then I saw it. A single, microscopic scratch on the chrome casing of my electron microscope, near the access panel. It was barely visible, a hairline fracture in the polished surface, but I knew it hadn't been there. I prided myself on the immaculate condition of my instruments. My gaze drifted to the corner of the lab where I kept my secure data server. The small, almost imperceptible tilt of the external cooling fan. I always checked it, a ritual of OCD. It was angled down by maybe a millimeter. Someone had been in here. Not to destroy, but to look. To implant, perhaps, or to extract. A shiver ran down my spine, not of fear, but of grim certainty. They weren't just watching, they were getting closer. The chime of the lab entrance startled me. Maya. I walked to the door, my hand hovering near the emergency button. She stood there, her face pale, eyes wide and darting. He clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest. "Read," he breathed, stepping inside. I think I know something." I led him to a small, private office adjacent to the main lab. The air in the room felt heavy with unspoken fears. "What is it, Maya?" I kept my voice low, steady. She set her satchel on the desk and wrung her hands. "Before Thorne. Before it happened. He was so agitated. More than usual. He kept talking about someone trying to get at his research, but I thought it was just stress, his paranoia getting the best of him." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But then, a few weeks before, I saw it." "Saw what?" I urged. "A truck. A nondescript white panel truck, parked outside the lab late at night. 3 nights in a row. It wasn't our usual delivery service. And I saw someone. Not Thorne, not anyone I recognized. Entering the lab through the service entrance. After hours. They had a key card. I thought maybe Thorne had authorized a late-night delivery, but he never mentioned it. And the person. They moved like they didn't want to be seen. My mind raced. An unknown individual, a key card, late-night access. "Did you tell anyone?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No. I was scared. Thorne had warned me about sharing anything. He said if anyone found out about his final project, it would put us all in danger. And now he's gone, and I keep thinking. You saw this individual, how many times?" "At least 3 times, over 2 weeks. Always late. Always the white truck. And the person always went straight to Thorne's secure wing. I thought maybe they were doing maintenance, but they looked furtive. Like they shouldn't have been there. The polymer, the near miss, the breached lab. And now, an unknown individual with a keycard, accessing Thorne's lab before his death. Thorne's paranoia wasn't just a symptom, it was a blueprint. He hadn't been imagining things. Someone had been watching him, waiting, and had indeed accessed his lab, potentially planting or removing something critical. The mystery was deepening, and the threats were escalating. I was closing in, and they knew it. Audible. He started changing his passwords daily, installing new security. He even talked about replacing his own identity, creating a new digital footprint, a ghost in the machine. Who were they, Maya? She shivered. He never said. Just them. He became convinced someone was inside his network, watching him. He even thought someone was physically entering the lab after hours, though the security logs never showed it. He said he saw a shadow, a fleeting reflection in a polished surface, but dismissed it as exhaustion. He was so paranoid, it was hard to tell what was real and what was his mind playing tricks him. Words, unsettling as they were, painted a clearer picture of Thorne's final days, a man under extreme pressure, not just from his groundbreaking work, but from an unseen adversary. An adversary with the skill to bypass his digital defenses and perhaps, even his physical ones. Back in the police department basement, the spectral analysis of the microscopic speck found on Thorne's arm finally yielded its secrets. The forensic specialist, a meticulous man named David, called me over to his workstation. "Reed, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice a mix of awe and bewilderment. He zoomed in on the image on his screen, a highly magnified, iridescent shard, its surface shimmering with complex molecular bonds. "It's a synthetic polymer. Extremely rare. We've cross-referenced it with every known database, and it's a proprietary material. Used in high-end industrial applications, specifically for ultra-durable, heat-resistant coatings on specialized machinery. Think aerospace, deep-sea drilling, or highly advanced biocontainment systems." "Any manufacturers?" I asked, my mind already racing. "Only one known to produce this exact variant, Omnicorp. They hold the patent. It's their signature polymer, the flickering fluorescent lights of the police department basement holding forensic samples cast long, shifting shadows as I hunched over the workstation. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, did little to clear my head. Thorne's digital archives, meticulously copied from his lab servers, glowed on the screen before me, an overwhelming labyrinth of data. The keycard access, the polymer residue, the near-miss explosion, each piece screamed precision, a calculated orchestration designed not just to kill, but to erase, to obscure. A simple theft of research wouldn't require such an elaborate charade. A thief would grab the data, maybe silence Thorne with a quick, brutal efficiency, then vanish, but this? This was performance art, a deliberate misdirection crafted to look like a tragic accident or a desperate suicide. Why go to such lengths to frame the death? To conceal the true nature of the act, yes, but also, I suspected, to bury the reason for it. The killer wasn't just after Thorne's work, they were trying to prevent its completion, or, more critically, its public release. I scrubbed a hand over my jaw, the stubble rasping. If Thorne had been working on something truly world-changing, something that could be weaponized, then the motive shifted from corporate espionage to something far more sinister: control. Control over the technology, and control over the narrative surrounding it. My gaze drifted back to the monitor, scanning file directories. Thorne's project data was organized with almost obsessive detail, each experiment, each variable, each result meticulously logged. But I was looking for something that wasn't meticulously logged, something hidden. Paranoia, Thorne's colleague had called it. I now knew it was prescience. He hadn't just imagined threats, he'd prepared for them. I dove deeper, bypassing the main project directories and sifting through personal files, archived communications, even the deleted items folder. Most of it was mundane, a digital echo of a lonely existence. Then I found it. A small, innocuous-looking file named _backup_log_v3.dat. It was buried several layers deep within a seemingly random directory of system utilities, timestamped just days before his death. The file size was disproportionately large for a simple log. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a forensic analysis. The preliminary scan confirmed my suspicion. The file was heavily encrypted, far beyond what a standard backup log would require. This wasn't just data, this was a vault. Thorne had built his own digital safe house. The encryption method was robust, a multi-layered algorithm I recognized as proprietary, likely something Thorne himself had developed or heavily modified. It took hours of dedicated processing, cycling through algorithms, testing potential keys gleaned from his other digital fragments, birthdates, project codenames, obscure scientific references. The hum of the server racks in the basement grew louder in my ears, a relentless drone against the quiet tension in my chest. Each failed attempt was a prick of frustration, but I pushed through, my determination hardening. Thorne had hidden this for a reason, and I intended to find out what it was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a cascade of green text scrolled across the screen, signaling a successful decryption. The file opened, revealing not a single document, but a series of journal entries, raw and unfiltered. This wasn't scientific data, this was Thorne's conscience laid bare. Entry 147, the applications. They're going beyond the scope of benevolent advancement. Omnicorp's interest is too specific, too aggressive. My funding comes with increasingly disturbing caveats. My breath hitched. Omnicorp. The corporate giant known for its aggressive acquisition strategies and its near monopoly on advanced materials. They were Thorne's primary benefactor. Entry 151, they've started asking for modifications, theoretical pathways to enhance kinetic impact. They cloak it in terms of the structural integrity for extreme environments, but I'm not blind. They want to turn my polymer into a delivery mechanism. The polymer. The same polymer found at the blast site. Entry 163, I've discovered their clandestine project. Project Chimera. Separate from my official work, but leveraging my fundamental theories. They're developing a method for mass-scale dispersal, a way to weaponize environmental control. Not just the polymer, but something far more insidious, something that could alter ecosystems, or worse, populations. They're calling it a terraforming initiative, but the parameters are terrifying. They're funding it offshore, through shell corporations I only stumbled upon through a corrupted data packet on a shared network drive. The words hit me like a physical blow. Weaponized environmental control. Mass-scale dispersal. This wasn't about a new material anymore. This was about global power, about a terrifying capability that could reshape the world, not for the better, but through coercion and destruction. Entry 170, my ethical concerns have been dismissed, categorized as unfounded anxieties. They know I know. I've started compiling everything. The proof of Omnicorp's true intentions, their clandestine funding of Chimera, the direct links to weaponization. I can't let this go public under their control. I will expose them. I have to. The final entry was dated the day before his death. I leaned back, the chair groaning under my sudden weight. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Thorne hadn't been killed because he was working on something valuable, he was killed because he was about to expose something monstrous. The elaborate murder, the staged accident, the precise polymer, it was all designed to ensure that Thorne's death would be ruled an unfortunate incident, his warnings dismissed as the ravings of a reclusive genius. They wanted to prevent the release of this information, to protect Project Chimera and Omnicorp's involvement. The killer wasn't just a rival or a thief. They were a gatekeeper, a protector of a secret so vast and so dangerous that they were willing to orchestrate a perfect murder to keep it buried. The tension in the basement thickened, pressing down on me. I wasn't just investigating a murder anymore, I was standing on the precipice of a global conspiracy, and Thorne's encrypted logs were the only light I had. This was far bigger than I'd imagined. Forward, his voice dropping slightly. Omnicorp has been fully cooperative, offering all assistance. We've even offered to provide our own internal investigators to help with the cleanup. We want answers as much as you do. His overly cooperative demeanor, the eagerness to offer assistance, the subtle redirecting of responsibility, it all felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. He wasn't just a liaison, he was a gatekeeper, protecting Omnicorp's interests, and possibly, its secrets. The polymer was a direct link, but Davies was doing his best to make it seem innocuous, a mere byproduct of their generous support. But accidents started subtly, a creeping unease that quickly escalated into undeniable threats. I was leaving the precinct one evening, my mind still replaying Davies's evasive answers, when a black sedan, appearing from nowhere, swerved violently towards me at an intersection. The screech of tires, the blare of the horn, the rush of wind as it narrowly missed me, it was too close, too deliberate to be random. I felt the chilling certainty that I was no longer just investigating, I was being warned. The next incident was more personal. I returned to my personal lab, a small, cluttered space in the police department basement where I often processed sensitive samples away from prying eyes, to find a precise, almost surgical disruption. Nothing was stolen, nothing overtly damaged. But my microscope was slightly off-kilter, a sterile swab had been moved from its designated tray, and a faint, almost metallic scent lingered in the air, something I couldn't immediately identify, but knew wasn't usually present. It was a message, "We know where you work. We can get to you." The threat solidified my resolve. Someone was actively trying to impede my investigation, to scare me off. This wasn't just corporate espionage, this was murder, and someone powerful wanted it to remain an accident. I immediately contacted Maya. Her voice on the phone was a thin thread of fear. "Reed, I need to tell you something. I think I know who Thorne meant. About someone getting into the lab. I met her at a neutral location, a crowded coffee shop far from the university." He was shaking, clutching her cup with white knuckles. "After you asked me about the data wipe, I remembered something else. Something Thorne said. He was convinced someone was in the lab, physically, after hours. He dismissed it as paranoia, but I saw it once, too." "What did you see, Maya?" I urged, trying to keep my voice calm. "It was about 3 weeks before it happened. I was working late, trying to finish up some administrative tasks. Thorne had already left. I was locking up, and I saw a flicker of movement in the main lab area. Just a shadow, really, but it was inside. I thought it was Thorne, that he'd forgotten something, but then I heard the security system re-engage, the double-lock sequence. It was too fast, too smooth for a normal exit. Like someone had bypassed it, then reset it perfectly." "Could you identify the person?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "No. It was dark, and they were gone in an instant. Just a silhouette. But I remember the way they moved. Not furtive, not panicked. Purposeful. Like they belonged there. And I smelled something. A strange, almost sweet, metallic scent. I dismissed it then, thought it was just some new reagent Thorne was experimenting with, but now." The chair groaned a second time as I pushed off, the sound echoing in the hushed lab. Thorne hadn't just been on the verge of a breakthrough, he'd been on the verge of a disclosure. The final journal entry, scrawled with an urgency I now recognized as desperation, laid it bare: a systemic deception, a deliberate misrepresentation of test results, a corporate cover-up of epic proportions. His brother, David, head of Omnicorp's internal security, had been the enforcer, the gatekeeper of those secrets. And now, the killer. I didn't waste a second. My call to the lead detective was brief, precise. David Thorne, Omnicorp's head of security. He killed his brother. I have the motive and the means. The ensuing hours were a blur of coordinated action. Warrants were issued, teams deployed. By the time I arrived at the police department basement holding forensic samples, the news had already broken. The air in the usually placid facility crackled with an unfamiliar tension. Uniformed officers moved with a heightened sense of purpose, their faces grim, their voices low. My boots on the concrete floor seemed unusually loud. I found the lead detective, a woman named Miller, leaning against a steel shelving unit, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. She ended the call with a curt nod and pocketed the device. "He's in custody," she stated, her voice hoarse. "Apprehended at his penthouse. Didn't resist. Said he knew this day would come." "Did he confess?" I asked, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. Miller sighed, running a hand through her short, dark hair. "Not directly. But the evidence we found at his residence, coupled with what you dug up, it's damning. Financial records linking him to offshore accounts, encrypted communications with other Omnicorp executives discussing containment protocols for Aris's disloyalty. I walked past a row of evidence lockers, their contents a silent testament to countless unseen tragedies. The thought of Thorne, a man dedicated to scientific integrity, being silenced by his own brother for corporate gain, left a bitter taste. "The deeper implications," I began, gesturing vaguely towards the ceiling, as if the entire corporate structure of Omnicorp existed just above us. Miller nodded, her gaze distant. "The whole damn structure is shaking. David Thorne wasn't acting alone. We've already moved on 2 senior research directors and a board member. The Attorney General's office is preparing indictments as we speak. This isn't just a murder, it's a corporate cleansing." The media, always hungry, had descended like vultures. From my office window, I'd watched the flashing lights of news vans illuminate the street outside, a constant, pulsating beacon of public outrage. Every screen in the department was tuned to a different news channel, each anchor breathlessly detailing the unfolding scandal. Omnicorp, once an untouchable titan of innovation, was now a pariah, its stock plummeting, its reputation in tatters. The public's shock was palpable, a collective gasp of betrayal at the hands of those they trusted to push the boundaries of human potential. Later that evening, the basement was quieter, though the underlying hum of activity never truly ceased. I sat at a stainless steel table, reviewing the last of Aris Thorne's personal effects, a worn leather wallet, a pair of reading glasses, a single, dog-eared photograph of 2 young boys, Aris and David, their arms slung around each other, grinning widely. A relic from a time before ambition and greed had twisted their bond into something lethal. My mind drifted to the ethical questions that now swirled around Thorne's groundbreaking research. The initial public reaction had been one of horror, a fear that such powerful technology, if wielded by unscrupulous hands, could be catastrophic. There were calls for moratoriums, for stricter regulations, for an entirely new framework governing scientific advancement. Governments and international organizations, sensing the immense power latent in Thorne's discoveries, were already circling like sharks, vying for control, for access, for the ability to dictate its future. I knew the research itself wasn't inherently evil. It was the people, the corporate machines, that corrupted it. Aris Thorne had seen that corruption, had tried to expose it, and had paid the ultimate price. His death wasn't just a solved case, it was a stark, brutal lesson in the perilous intersection of genius, power, and human fallibility. The investigation into his murder had ripped open a wound, exposing the rot beneath the polished facade of progress. And now, the world had to decide how to heal it, or risk succumbing to the infection. The future of Thorne's legacy, and perhaps much more, hung precariously in the balance. Environment primed for extreme combustion. The catalytic agent lowered the ignition threshold. The energy surge in the adjacent workstation was the spark, timed perfectly to ignite the volatile reagents, not in Thorne's main area. Near it, creating a directed blast. The structural engineers, cross-referencing this data with the physical damage, pointed to the geometric scorch mark I had noticed on my first visit. That mark, Reed, one of them explained, it's consistent with the point of initial, superheated impact. The energy surge was channeled, focused, hitting that precise spot first, creating a flashpoint for the larger conflagration. It was designed to look like a spontaneous, chaotic explosion, but the initial trigger was pinpoint accurate. The picture snapped into terrifying clarity. That accident was a sophisticated, multi-stage act of murder. The killer hadn't just blown up a lab, they had engineered a fatal event that mimicked a research malfunction, triggered remotely, designed to eliminate Thorne and destroy his critical research. The method pointed to someone with an expert, almost intimate, knowledge of Thorne's specific protocols, his bespoke lab systems, and the volatile nature of his Project Chimera. The culprit had understood Thorne's work better than anyone, perhaps even better than Thorne himself. They knew the precise vulnerabilities, the exact sequence of events that would create a devastating, yet perfectly deniable, catastrophe. The rare synthetic polymer, the distinct scent, the digital manipulation, the engineered blast, all pieces of a meticulously crafted puzzle. I had the how, the what, and the why. Thorne's identity-altering research was either too valuable to be left in his hands, or too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The killer, hidden behind layers of corporate power and carefully orchestrated sabotage, had erased Thorne's identity, alone.